Hello and welcome to another episode of A Closer Look, our weekly news show where we take a deep dive into some of the biggest stories in the Middle East. This is me, Anjana Sankar, joining you from the National's newsroom in Abu Dhabi. This has been a happening week for the UAE's space program. We are just a few days away from a new launch date for Rashid Rover, the first Emirati mission to Moon. This week, Abu Dhabi also hosted one of the biggest space events of the region. The Abu Dhabi Space Debate, held on December 5th and 6th, brought together experts, scientists, and even heads of state to discuss the future of space and the challenges it faces. My colleague Sarwat Nasir joins me here with all the details.
This is the space launch capital of America. The Kennedy Space Center and the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station is where some of the most historic space missions have taken off since the birth of the US space program in the 1950s, including the Apollo program, which helped mankind put its first step on the moon. Now, in this new space era, more countries are getting the opportunity to lift off their space program from the many active space pads here in Florida. This includes the United Arab Emirates.
Welcome, Sarwat. It's good to have you here. You're just back from Florida, where the Rashid Rover was supposed to blast off. So tell us what happened there.
Right. Well, thanks for having me. Yes, I've just gotten back from Florida a couple of days ago. I was there to cover the launch of the UAE's first moon mission, which involves a small rover called Rashid. It was supposed to blast off on November 28th, then November 30, then December 1. The launch date was postponed a couple of times. The latest incident, what happened was that there was an issue with the Falcon 9 rocket, which it was supposed to launch on. Now, SpaceX has not specified what exactly the problem was. However, iSpace, which is the company that is providing the lunar lander, which the rover will launch on, it said it is discussing with SpaceX to identify a new target launch date. But I do think that it should happen within this month, and we're going to see eventually the first Arab mission to the moon launch from Florida's Cape Canaveral.
Yeah, so maybe this Friday.
Maybe this Friday. So the U.S. Space Force actually issued a launch probability for December 7, and I believe there's a launch window from December 7 to December 10. So there's a possibility it can launch then. However, SpaceX has not issued any kind of comment, and they're the ones who are going to go ahead and give that target launch date once it's been finalized.
Okay, so let's wait and watch. But let's talk about the Abu Dhabi Space Debate. You were covering it yesterday and today. UAE is relatively a new player in space technology. So how important is it that we are hosting one of the biggest space events of the region here?
Right. Well, Abu Dhabi Space Debate, this is the first event of its kind that's happening here in the UAE. It's set up by the UAE Space Agency, and it's brought together hundreds of experts from space agencies, the government, researchers, private companies. So it's quite an exciting conference in terms of discussing sort of the new geopolitics of space, emerging trends, the rise of the private industry in space. So from that point of view, it's quite interesting. And why it's important for the UAE to be hosting this, we have hosted conferences, space conferences in the past, such as the International Astronautical Congress, which is organized by the International Astronautical Federation. Dubai, the MBRSC, the Space Center was able to host it. However, this specific conference has been organized and is set up completely by the UAE Space Agency. And, we're getting experts from all over the world sort of discussing important topics such as the new geopolitics of space, such as, like I mentioned, the rise of private players and how they're having an impact in the global space sector. Creating that market in space, such as commercial space stations, for example. There were really hard topics that were discussed, such as how to protect low Earth orbit from, mega constellation, space traffic, as well as whether there are enough regulations and policies in place as commercial players increase their activities in space. While there are treaties like the UN Outer Space Treaty and the US-led Artemis Accords, which outline peaceful and responsible space exploration. However, there are no details that specify these new activities in space, such as lunar resource utilization, space traffic, these kind of things.
Yeah. So it's important to have these conversations because, as we knew, space technology was all about nations building space capabilities for their countries. But now, as you said, space is geopolitics, it is an economy, it is an industry. So how do you think these conversations where you bring stakeholders from all across the world will shape up the future space explorations and technology development?
I think we kind of already see that happening. So the reason that these conferences are so useful, such as the Abu Dhabi space debate, is because not only did it bring people from the government, researchers, and even the military, for example, to a conference, but it also brought private players who can engage in those conversations. And what we're seeing now is, the private industry on the rise. For example, for decades, the space program was run by governments. NASA was launching astronauts to space. Russia, for example, Roscosmos was launching astronaut satellites to space. What we're seeing now is companies, for example, and that's a leading company, SpaceX, really leading the way in the private industry space. And we see NASA, through its commercial crew program, it's finally launching astronauts from U.S. soil again after relying on Russia's Soyuz rocket for more than a decade. And right now it's using SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket and the Crew Dragon capsule to launch astronauts from space. We're going to see a UAE astronaut, Sultan Al Nayati, launch on a Crew Dragon. That'll be the Arab world's first astronaut. That'll be on a SpaceX rocket. So that'll be quite exciting. It's not just SpaceX. We're going to see Boeing as well, who's developing the Starliner crew capsule. So that's part of NASA's commercial crew program. We're going to see astronauts potentially launching on that too. And I believe Boeing has the first crew test flight on a Starliner next year. So I think a lot of emerging space nations like the UAE who want to have a long-term human spaceflight program, and even Saudi Arabia, who's launching 2 astronauts on a SpaceX rocket next year, are keeping an eye on companies like Boeing, who will have that launch capability to, finally launch more and more astronauts and have a long-term sustainable human spaceflight program.
I mean, listening to you, it looks like space is getting into a busy, crowded place. But with so many private players getting into the space, I think they will also need to come up with new regulations. So what kind of things did they discuss at this Abu Dhabi space debate?
Regulations were certainly something that was discussed, especially in terms of space traffic. And there are policies in place by governments. For example, in the UAE Space Agency did work on a very extensive space law. Even though the space industry is so new here, it's so important to have these regulations in place. For example, the space law here, which was launched, I believe, in 2018, discusses, who can launch anything to space, how far it can go, what kind of license do you need, how do you apply for that license. The US space policy, for example, is so extensive, talks about what kind of license do you need? SpaceX, for example, has plans to launch 30,000 Starlink satellites as part of its mega constellation. However, US regulators recently approved only about a bit more than 7,000 of the satellites. So we're seeing how governments govern and make sure they're policing private companies and their activities as well. However, having said that, it's also important that governments monitor private companies, but also encourage and create that environment for those activities to continue to take place. Because as we've learned, governments can't do space alone. We need the private companies.
Providers, yeah.
That's why, for example, the UAE, if they're creating that environment for the private space sector. They're kind of trying to create that industry. So the UAE Space Agency is actually setting up a lot of economic zones where private players can, seek some kind of long-term establishment and really take advantage of what the UAE is offering in terms of space activities.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarwat, for joining us and giving us all the details about this very important debate that happened right here in Abu Dhabi. Stay tuned to The National, where Sarwat will be tracking the launch date of Rashid Rover in Florida and all other top stories. Thank you for joining us, and see you next week for another episode of A Closer Look.